When she told me she had a work trip coming up, I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't the first time she'd had to go out of town for business, and it wasn't uncommon for her to be gone for a few days at a time. Corporate life, right? But this time, something felt off. You know that gut feeling you get when something just doesn't add up? It was gnawing at me the entire week leading up to the trip. It wasn't one specific thing that tipped me off, more like a collection of small, subtle changes. She was spending more time on her phone, texting late at night, and making sure to angle the screen away from me whenever I walked into the room. She'd been working out more, too, more than usual, and while I loved that about her, it made me wonder. It wasn't just about staying fit anymore, it felt like she was trying to impress someone. When the trip was only a day away, I casually asked about it. "So, where are you headed this time? Still in the city?" "Yeah," she replied, almost too quickly, without making eye contact. "It's a new client. I'll be gone for 3 days, staying at that downtown Marriott." Something in her tone was different. Not the usual casual way she'd talk about work. And the Marriott? Seemed normal enough, but I remembered her mentioning the company had recently downsized and started cutting costs, no more fancy accommodations. Red flag number 1. I nodded, not wanting to push it right then. But I knew I had to keep an eye on things. That night, after she fell asleep, I made my move. See, I'm not proud of what I did next, but when your marriage feels like it's slipping through your fingers, you start doing things you never thought you'd do. I accessed her phone, just for a second, just to check. And there it was. Location sharing turned on, most likely without her even realizing. My heart raced as I noted the icon, a cabin resort, far from the city she claimed to be staying in. 200 miles away. Deep in the mountains. I could feel my blood pressure spike. She hadn't left yet, but now I knew. Whatever this work trip was, it had nothing to do with a downtown Marriott. And everything to do with lies. I had no idea how bad it would get from there. What should I do next? Should I confront her now, before she even leaves? Or wait? I decided to wait. She packed her bags the next morning, kissed me goodbye, and said she'd see me in a few days. I didn't respond, just gave her a stiff nod. She probably thought I was distracted with work or tired, but really, I was planning. As soon as she left, I got dressed, grabbed my car keys, and followed her. If my suspicions were right, I had to see it with my own eyes. 200 miles later, I would know the truth. The drive felt like it lasted a lifetime. I couldn't focus on the road, my thoughts racing with all the worst-case scenarios. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with every mile. I tried to keep it together, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, I was wrong. Maybe she really was working, maybe there was some explanation for the location. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew better. I'd been replaying every recent conversation, every little detail I'd missed in the past few weeks. Her laughter that used to be carefree was forced now. She spent more time scrolling through her phone than talking to me, and those late nights at the office had become more frequent. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. I just didn't want to admit what they spelled out. Halfway there, I had to pull over at a rest stop. My stomach was in knots, and my head felt like it was going to explode. I sat there, staring at the gas station lights in the distance, trying to figure out what I'd say when I got there, if I even said anything at all. I mean, what was I going to do? Walk up to the front door of the cabin and knock? Burst in and catch them in the act? What if I was wrong? What if she really was on a work trip and I was being a paranoid asshole? No. I couldn't risk being wrong, but I couldn't ignore the signs either. I decided to keep going, to see it through. If I didn't, I'd never be able to live with myself. As I got closer to the location, the surroundings began to change. The highway narrowed into a 2-lane road, winding through thick forests and up into the mountains. The air grew colder, cleaner, but the peaceful atmosphere just made me feel worse. How many times had we talked about getting away like this? Just the two of us, out in nature, far from the city and the stress of our lives. And here she was, using that dream as a cover for her lies. I passed a wooden sign welcoming me to the mountain resort area. Cabins dotted the landscape, each one isolated enough to feel private, surrounded by trees and scenic views. Perfect for a romantic getaway. Perfect for her and her coworker. I parked my car about a mile away from the exact location her phone was pinging from, not wanting to give myself away too soon. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. The last stretch of the journey was on foot. I walked up a narrow dirt path, weaving through the trees, until I saw it. The cabin. It was more of a luxury lodge, really, massive, with huge glass windows and a deck overlooking the mountains. It looked like something straight out of a brochure, the kind of place you'd imagine spending a honeymoon or celebrating an anniversary. I felt sick. I crouched behind a tree, close enough to see inside but far enough that I wouldn't be spotted. I waited, the minutes dragging on as I watched for any sign of life inside. And then I saw her. My wife. Laughing, glass of wine in her hand, looking relaxed and carefree. She was wearing that light summer dress she knew I loved. The one that made her look effortlessly stunning, showing off her tanned, athletic legs. She looked happy. Happier than I'd seen her in months. And she wasn't alone. The door opened, and he walked out, tall, dark-haired, dressed casually in shorts and a t-shirt, like this was just another weekend getaway. My stomach clenched. It was him. Her coworker. The one she'd mentioned offhandedly a few times in conversation. The guy from her team who always seemed to be at the same dinners, the same late meetings. And now, he was here with her. They were laughing together, clinking their wine glasses like they didn't have a care in the world. Like they weren't betraying me in the most painful way possible. I stood there, frozen. My mind raced, but my body felt paralyzed. This was it. This was the proof I needed. She was cheating on me, right here in front of my eyes. But what was I supposed to do now? Storm in there and confront them? Wait until they went to bed and catch them red-handed? My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I knew I couldn't stand there forever. I had to make a decision. But what do you do when the life you thought you had crumbles right in front of you? I don't know how long I stood there, watching them through the large windows. Time blurred. My mind kept cycling between rage and disbelief. They were laughing like they didn't have a care in the world, oblivious to the fact that their perfect little bubble was about to burst. My fists clenched by my sides, every fiber of my being screaming to storm in and tear it all apart. But I couldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, staring at a life that should have been mine. A life that she and I had talked about for years, weekends away, quiet nights, a glass of wine on the deck as the sun set behind the mountains. I felt like a fool. A complete, pathetic fool. I remembered the first time she'd mentioned him, her coworker, Greg. It was casual at first. He was just someone from the office, she'd said. They had started working on a project together, something about needing to collaborate on presentations for a new client. I hadn't thought much of it. She had guy friends, and I trusted her. I never saw the warning signs. But looking at them now, the way he leaned in just a little too close, the way her hand casually touched his arm as she laughed at something he said, it was obvious. That tension between them, it wasn't new. It had been building for months, and I had been too blind to see it. Suddenly, I remembered one of those work dinners, a few weeks back. She had come home late, smelling faintly of wine and perfume, her hair slightly disheveled. I asked how it went, and she brushed it off. Long day, she'd said, before heading straight to the shower. I didn't think twice about it then. But now, looking back, I realized how naive I'd been. I felt the anger rise again, hot and uncontrollable. My breathing quickened, and I had to force myself to stay calm. Barging in there wasn't going to solve anything. But what would? Exposing them? Confronting her? There was no easy answer. A light breeze rustled through the trees, and I watched as they moved to the deck. She was still holding her wine glass, now laughing at something he said. He moved closer, his hand resting on her lower back, way too familiar for a coworker. That's when I saw it. She leaned into him, just a bit, but enough to make my stomach churn. Her body language was different around him, more relaxed, more open. She looked up at him with that smile I hadn't seen in months. The smile she used to give me. I couldn't watch anymore. I turned away, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. What was I supposed to do? Go back home and pretend like nothing was wrong? Wait for her to come back from her work trip and lie to my face again? No. That wasn't an option anymore. I pulled out my phone and opened the tracker again, just to make sure I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But there it was, her location, pinned exactly where I was standing. The cabin. The proof. But what good was proof when your whole world was falling apart? I thought about sending her a message, right then and there. Something simple. Something like, I know. But then what? What would she say? What excuse could she possibly have to explain this away? I couldn't think straight. The rational part of me wanted to plan, to figure out the best way to handle this without making things worse. But the emotional part, the part of me that had been crushed by the woman I thought I knew, wanted to walk up to that door, knock, and watch the color drain from her face when she saw me standing there. I stared at the cabin one last time before turning around and walking back into the trees. I needed space to think. To plan. To decide my next move. Because once I stepped into that cabin, there would be no going back. As I walked deeper into the woods, I could feel my mind unraveling, spinning between the possibilities of what might happen next. I needed to cool off. Every step away from that cabin gave me a little more clarity, a little more time to think through my next move. There were 100 different ways this could play out, but I knew that one wrong step could make things spiral out of control. The temptation to confront them immediately was overwhelming, but I didn't want to act out of pure emotion. I wanted answers, real answers. I wanted to hear her try and justify this. I sat down on a fallen log, pulling my phone out of my pocket. My hand hovered over her contact. What would she even say if I called her right now? If I told her that I knew exactly where she was and who she was with? Would she lie? Would she try to twist the situation, make it seem like I was being paranoid? Part of me was afraid of hearing her voice because I knew it would be dripping with false sincerity. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I opened her messages. I hadn't looked through her phone like that until now. I'd tracked her location, yes, but this was different. This was crossing a line I never thought I would. But at this point, the rules had already been broken. As the messages loaded, I scrolled quickly through the familiar names, her friends, coworkers, family. And then I saw it. Greg. The coworker. My heart pounded as I tapped on their conversation. The latest message was from her, sent just this morning before she left. Can't wait for this weekend. So glad we finally get some time together. Time together. I scrolled further, my blood boiling with each new message I read. They had been talking for weeks, maybe months. The flirty comments, the inside jokes, the suggestive texts, it was all there. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I reached one of the messages from about a week ago, when she'd told me she had a late meeting. Apparently, the meeting was with Greg, at his place. The texts made it clear they had already crossed that line long before this weekend trip. My suspicions were more than confirmed. They weren't just hooking up, they were building something behind my back. I wanted to throw my phone, smash it against the nearest tree, but I held back. This was my proof. My final confirmation that our marriage had been reduced to lies and betrayal. I sat there for a while, just staring at the screen, letting it all sink in. I'd worked so hard to give her the life she wanted, the house, the vacations, the little luxuries she loved. I'd worked overtime, taken on extra projects, done everything I could to make sure we were comfortable. And now, it felt like I had been funding her affair, paying for the lifestyle that she was sharing with someone else. The rage was still there, bubbling under the surface, but something else was creeping in now. A cold, calculated sense of purpose. I wasn't going to just explode into that cabin and give them the satisfaction of seeing me broken. No. If this was how it was going to end, I wanted to be in control. I decided right then that I wasn't going to let her dictate how this played out. I had options. Maybe I'd wait until they were deep into their evening, wait until they felt completely secure in their little fantasy, then walk in and watch their faces crumble. Or maybe I'd leave, wait until she came home, and confront her there, where she couldn't hide behind her lover. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't going to let this slide. I stood up, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders but strangely empowering. I walked back toward my car, away from the cabin, away from the scene of their betrayal. It wasn't time yet. I wasn't ready to make my move. Not tonight. But soon. I'd give them one more night to bask in their lies. Then I'd destroy everything they'd built together. That night was one of the longest of my life. I drove back to the nearest town, finding a small, cheap motel just off the highway. It was nothing like the luxury cabin my wife was staying in, just a dingy room with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of cigarettes in the air. It was the kind of place you stay in when you don't want to be found, and that suited me just fine. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the TV I hadn't bothered turning on, the weight of the situation settled in. My mind kept replaying everything I'd seen. Her laughing with him, the messages between them, the casual intimacy that they had clearly grown comfortable with. This wasn't some one-time mistake. This was planned. This was deliberate. And that's what hurt the most. I couldn't sleep, not with my mind running a mile a minute. I kept wondering how long it had been going on, how many times she had lied to my face with that same smile I had fallen in love with. It felt like my entire marriage had been a facade, a carefully constructed illusion meant to keep me blind while she lived another life behind my back. I had half a mind to go back to that cabin right then, to end it all in a single explosive confrontation. But I forced myself to stay put. This wasn't going to end in some messy fight fueled by anger. I needed to be smart about this, no matter how badly I wanted to kick down that door and make her see what she had done to me. Instead, I paced the room, thinking about how I would approach her when the time came. What could I even say? What was there to say? She had already shown me everything I needed to know. Any conversation we had would just be an exercise in watching her try to scramble for an excuse. But I also knew I wanted to hear it from her own mouth. I wanted her to look me in the eye and tell me why she had done it. Maybe it was closure, or maybe it was just a twisted need to see her squirm. Either way, I wasn't going to leave this unresolved. At some point, I must have dozed off for a few hours, though it didn't feel like sleep. It was restless, my mind still stuck on images of her and Greg in that cabin, playing house while I rotted away in the shitty motel room. When I woke up, the sun was barely rising. I checked her location again out of habit. Still at the cabin. Of course she was. They were probably still sleeping, blissfully unaware that their little getaway was about to come crashing down. I got up, splashed some cold water on my face, and stared at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, worn out, like I hadn't slept in days. In a way, I hadn't. Not really. I grabbed my keys and stepped outside into the chilly morning air, taking a deep breath. Today was the day. I was done waiting. I wasn't going to drag this out any longer than it needed to be. I was going to drive back up that mountain, knock on the door, and end this once and for all. The thought of seeing their faces, the sheer shock when they realized I had been there the whole time, made my pulse race. It was a mixture of dread and satisfaction. And yet, part of me still wondered if I could handle it. Could I really face her and hear her excuses, her lies? Could I stand there and confront the reality I had been trying to avoid? I didn't have a choice. With the morning sun rising over the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees, I got back into the car and started the drive. The road seemed quieter now, the stillness of the early hours making everything feel surreal. As I got closer to the cabin, the tension built inside me, coiling tighter with every turn. This was it. No more waiting. I pulled over just before reaching the cabin, parking in the same spot I had the day before, hidden behind the trees. I needed a moment to steady myself, to prepare for what was about to happen. I wasn't going to rush in. I wasn't going to scream or cry or make a scene. I was going to stay calm, composed. I had the upper hand now. I knew the truth, and they didn't. And that was going to be my weapon. I started walking toward the cabin, every step bringing me closer to the end of everything I had known. The closer I got to the cabin, the more my heart pounded in my chest. I felt the adrenaline surging through me, but I was determined to stay in control. There was no room for second guessing now. I had to see this through. As I approached the cabin, I could see the morning light filtering through the large windows. Everything looked peaceful, serene, like any other morning in paradise. But I knew the storm that was about to hit inside. I stopped a few feet from the front door, my breath shallow and quick. I listened for any sound, any sign that they were awake. Through the window, I could see the remains of last night, empty wine glasses on the table, a bottle left uncorked, their clothes casually draped over the furniture. My stomach turned. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the front door, trying to gather the strength to do what needed to be done. This was the moment I had been building up to all night. The moment where everything would finally be laid bare. No more secrets. No more lies. With a deep breath, I raised my hand and knocked. The sound echoed through the stillness, loud and intrusive. For a second, I wondered if they'd even heard it. But then I heard movement inside, footsteps, hurried and confused. And then the door opened. It was her. She stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a thin robe, her long blonde hair still messy from sleep. For a brief moment, she looked like the woman I had loved, the woman I had married. But then reality hit, and the weight of her betrayal came crashing back down on me. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw me standing there. She froze, her hand gripping the edge of the door, her face going pale. "Wah, what are you doing here?" she stammered, clearly caught off guard. I didn't answer right away. I just stood there, taking in the sight of her, the woman who had lied to me, cheated on me, and now had the audacity to act surprised that I had found her. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice steady but cold. "You tell me, Sarah. You're the one who's been lying." Her eyes darted nervously, and she took a step back, as if she needed the physical distance to gather herself. I could see the gears turning in her head, trying to come up with an excuse, something to make this all go away. I can explain," she started, her voice shaky. "Can you?" I shot back, cutting her off before she could spin her web of lies. Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty clear. This work trip wasn't for work, was it? Her face flushed, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words. But nothing she could say would fix this. She knew it, and I knew it. Suddenly, I heard another set of footsteps behind her, and there he was, Greg, standing in the doorway to the bedroom, shirtless, looking like he had just woken up. His eyes flickered between us, and the realization of what was happening hit him like a freight train. "Shit," he muttered under his breath, stepping forward. "This isn't." "Shut up," I snapped, not even bothering to look at him. My focus was entirely on her. "Is this what you've been doing, Sarah? Lying to my face, pretending everything was fine while you're off here with him?" My voice was rising, and I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to keep it together. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up my hand, stopping her. "No. I don't want to hear whatever bullshit excuse you're about to come up with. I saw the messages. I know about the work dinners, the late nights. All of it. So don't even try to deny it." Her face crumpled, the weight of her lies finally crashing down on her. She stood there, silent, her eyes filled with guilt and shame. But she didn't deny it. She couldn't. I took a step back, the reality of the situation hitting me harder than I expected. This was it. There was nothing left to salvage. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built my life with, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. "You don't get to explain," I said, my voice steady but cold. "There's nothing to explain. It's over." I turned to leave, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me. But as I reached the edge of the porch, I stopped, glancing back one last time. "For what it's worth," I said, my voice bitter, "I hope it was worth destroying everything we had." And with that, I walked away. I didn't look back as I headed down the path, back toward my car. I didn't need to. I had all the answers I'd come for. There was no going back now. My marriage, my life as I knew it, was over. But at least now, I had the truth. I drove away from the cabin in silence, the morning sun casting long shadows over the winding mountain roads. The adrenaline had faded, leaving me feeling strangely numb, as if I had used up all my emotions back at the cabin. I didn't feel the explosive anger I had expected, or the crushing sadness. I just felt hollow. I thought about what I had said to her. "It's over." I knew I meant it, but it didn't feel real yet. The last few hours had been a blur, and now that I was alone again, the weight of what had happened was starting to sink in. Everything we had built together, the years we had spent as husband and wife, had been reduced to a pile of lies and broken promises. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and I glanced over to see her name on the screen. I ignored it, letting the call go to voicemail. What could she possibly say that would make any of this better? There was no apology that could undo what she'd done, no explanation that would make me want to take her back. As I drove, I found myself thinking about all the small moments that led up to this. The nights I spent working late to make sure we were financially secure, while she was out with him. The weekends I thought she was at work conferences or business meetings, when she was really sneaking off with her coworker. I had been living in a fantasy, blind to what was happening right in front of me. I pulled over at a scenic overlook, the valley stretching out below me, the mountains rising up in the distance. It was beautiful here, peaceful. The kind of place you'd want to come with someone you love, to escape the world for a while. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. This was supposed to be our life. Our dream. I stepped out of the car and leaned against the railing, staring out at the view. My mind wandered, trying to piece together what came next. Divorce, obviously. There was no coming back from this. But beyond that, I didn't know. I had spent so long building my life around her, around us, that I wasn't sure where to start rebuilding it alone. Part of me wanted to call someone, to talk it all out, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. It felt too raw, too personal. I wasn't ready for the pity or the "I told you so" conversations. I just needed time to process this, to figure out who I was without her. I pulled out my phone again and opened her messages. There were several new ones from her, each more desperate than the last. "Please, can we talk? I'm sorry, it wasn't what you think. We need to fix this." I deleted them without reading any more. What was there to fix? I wasn't interested in her explanations. The truth was already out there, and nothing she could say would change what I had seen. I had always thought our marriage was built on trust, on honesty, but clearly, that had been a one-sided belief. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. As I stood there, watching the sun rise higher in the sky, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't how I wanted things to end, but I didn't have control over that. What I did have control over was what happened next. I could choose to let this destroy me, to let the betrayal define my life from this point forward. Or I could move on. It wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't going to let this break me. I got back into the car, the engine rumbling to life as I pulled back onto the road. I didn't know where I was heading, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my own path. The future was uncertain, but at least it was mine again. As I drove, I glanced at my wedding ring, still sitting on my finger. It felt heavy, a symbol of something that no longer existed. I pulled it off and tossed it into the cup holder, the final weight of my old life dropping away. The road stretched out in front of me, and with it, the promise of something new. What would you do if you found out your partner was secretly going on vacations with someone else? Would you confront them in the moment or wait for the perfect time to strike?